David Frum is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of 10 books, most recently TRUMPOCALYPSE, Restoring American Democracy, published by HarperCollins in 2020. He holds a BA and an MA in history from Yale and a law degree from Harvard, where he served as president of the Federalist Society. He and his wife, Danielle Crittenden, live in Washington, D.C. and Wellington, Ontario, where we met last, adjacent to the lapping waves of Lake Ontario. Today, it's the Bay of Biscay. Welcome, David, again to the Biblio File.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to talk.
Today, actually, you're being welcomed to the Biblio File Book Club. So we are going to discuss several stories that you've identified as being very important to you, written by C.S. Forester. So here's C.S. Forester. He was born in 1899 in Cairo. He grew up in England with his divorced mother. He studied at Guy's Hospital right at about the same time that my grandfather studied there. So I'm thinking they might have even known each other.
Very interesting.
To me, it is.
Yeah.
He left without a degree to start writing as a journalist, but he's best known for writing the tales of naval warfare, most famously his 10-book Horatio Hornblower series, starting in 1937, which depicts a Royal Navy officer during the Napoleonic Wars. So I just want to read out a quick passage from one of the founders of Michael Joseph, the publisher of the Hornblower series, just because. And here it is. Forester once told me, and this is a book called Bound to be Read by Robert Lusty. Forester once told me that most of Hornblower's conundrums and their solutions came to him unbidden as he shaved. A psychoanalyst had heard this with much interest and was anxious to bustle Forester to a couch and ascertain the reason. Forester, who would in fact have been rather fascinated by this project, mercifully concluded the operation might well jeopardize Hornblower's future. I muttered a thankful prayer to God. Our future would have been in the balance as well. The first Hornblower novels arranged in haphazard fashion over his life. It was only later they became listed in chronological order. Winston Churchill was a great follower of Hornblower, and I used to send him a proof copy of each as soon as it appeared. He was always grateful. After the war and during the period he was out of office, I thought he might enjoy a meeting with Forester, and I let him know that Forester was on a short visit to London from his American home. To Forester's delight, the immediate response was an invitation to lunch. The old man, it appeared, was in splendid form, and Forester was greatly touched by his deference to a distinguished and professional author. My man Sawyer, announced Mr. Churchill at one point, is a great admirer of yours, as great as I am. I want him to meet you. And he rang the bell in summons. Sawyer, said Winston when he appeared, this is Mr. Forester, who writes those wonderful stories about Hornblower we both so much enjoy. So the two stories that you've chosen are The Cargo of Rice and The Penalty of Failure. They're one after the other. And They're found in Mr. Midshipman Hornblower, published by Michael Joseph in 1950. You've told me in an email that you think about these stories every single day. Why is it so important? Were these so important to you?
So I think I read them at an impressionable moment. I would have been probably 14, maybe 15, maybe 13, probably 14. And I just devoured the Hornblower books because the thing to understand about them is they are not sea stories. And that's one of the reasons why they have never been successfully adapted to the screen, because they're not even really adventure stories. They're psychological stories. So Hornblower is someone who comes into the Royal Navy, and in many ways he's unfit for it. He's very intellectual. He's very bookish. He is contemplative.
He's scared.
Well, he thinks he's scared. This is the appeal of the stories to a teenager is you come to understand Hornblower better than he understands himself. Hornblower is afraid of heights, but Hornblower consistently climbs heights. And Hornblower thinks he's a coward because he climbs heights even though he's scared of heights. But you understand that actually, for the person who's not scared of heights, there's no courage in climbing. And again, we see him overcoming fear through the process of thinking about fear. But he also is somebody with an acute sense of code. And this is, we were talking just before we started, but two of my favorite literary heroes are him and then Philip Marlowe from the Chandler stories. And these are both men whose lives are wrapped in code. And the two stories that we are talking about today are one where Hornblower, who I think is at the time of the story 17 or 18 years old, a midshipman, the most junior rank. And there's no process of formal education to get into the Royal Navy. You're just brought on board a boat and subjected to unbelievably brutal conditions. And we see some of those: bullying, horrible food. And you're in a system where the whole thing is enforced by systems of cruelty on the many naval enlistees who can be flogged, who can be harmed, who can be punished in all kinds of grotesque ways. So he's brought on board to this chaotic, overcrowded, dark environment, unclean, terrible food, rats everywhere, and he has to figure it out. And he's ambitious. He comes from a family with a little bit of education. His father's a doctor, but not much money. No one's going to be able to smooth his way with advantages. A person like that would be forgiven if they elbowed their way forward at every turn, but he doesn't. And he wants to advance, but he thinks about it. In these two stories, Hornblower is given his first independent job. They've captured a barge in the Bay of Biscay laden with rice from New Orleans.
Yeah.
Under the rules of war at that time, if you captured something like that, the capturing power can then sail the rice into the nearest British port. The rice will be auctioned off, and everybody on the ship will get a little piece of the action. Even a lowly midshipman will get a small amount of money. So this year, dealing directly with everybody's economic future. And indeed, that was an important part of the pay for naval officers and even naval men, the proceeds. And rice was an especially valuable cargo. So Hornblower was given the assignment: take this rice and get it into the nearest port. It's not that far away. You're in the Bay of Biscay near the English Channel. And and he leads a small prize crew aboard the barge full of rice.
I'll bring up the text and then you'll get your feedback on it, okay?
Okay.
So just to reinforce what you just said, Captain Edward Pellew, who seems to be hero of Hornblower.
He's one of the better officers. He's
yes.
brave, he's decisive, and he's fair-minded.
Here's just a line here on the second page of the cargo of rice. He said, "And the moment the prize crew was on its way, he filled his main topsail again and hurried off after the next victim." So he sounds like a bit of a predator.
Well, that's his job. He's commanding a frigate. He's waging naval warfare against France, which means cutting it off from world trade.
So here he is. Sorry, he just says, "Rice, that'll sell for a pretty penny when we get her home. 200 tons."
Yeah. So Hornblower's got a little bit of everybody's economic future. There'd been a battle, and the barge had been captured, and beforehand, and cannonballs had flown, and so Hornblower's worried. Has the barge been damaged? And so he keeps taking soundings in the hull of the ship to see, is the ship taking on water? And every sounding shows it's dry, no problem at all. Everything is going swimmingly. And then the boat, with its English crew of 4 and its French prisoners of 12, the boat begins to sink. Because the thing he didn't take on board was the rice would absorb the water. And he has made a total disaster of his first independent charge. But that's not the part of the story that is important to me. The point of the story, so then this leads to total disaster. The barge is captured by a French ship, and Hornblower is now faced with spending the rest of his naval career as a French prisoner of war until however long these wars are going to end. And that's it. That's curtains for him. He'll be in a prison for 4 years, 5 years, for a long time, and miss all chances of advancement.
Yes. Now, one of the things that he criticizes himself for is taking so long to basically weave this little sort of patch for that hole.
Yes.
And so they kind of slide it all the way around the bottom of the brig or the barge and then place it over the hole. But he
Right.
spent a good part of the story ticked off with himself for taking so long to do that.
So that what you see there is that he's this ingenious person. He is not a blood and guts officer. He's a thinking officer. He's a mechanical officer, and he's intensely self-critical. And then he fails, and then he fails. Despite his amazing efforts, he fails. And they are picked up, they are captured. He's on his way to a French prisoner of war camp. And then I'm going to simplify this. Then through an act of both incredible ingenuity and incredible courage, he liberates himself and his 3 companions and is picked up at sea by a British ship. And now there's a board of inquiry. And this is his chance to shine. If he tells the truth about how he liberated himself and his 3 crewmates, he will get a promotion. He will be a golden boy. This is his big break. But what he realizes is no one knows that it was his, because the French people who could have squealed on him, they're all gone. They're with the French again. No one knows about his mistake. And what he's being offered is an attempt to take credit for the thing he did well, while evading blame for the thing where he failed. And so he tells the board of inquiry that this heroic thing, an ingenious thing he did, was an accident, that he deserves no credit.
I'll read out how he puts it. He says, this is Pellew asking him this. "No, sir," said Hornblower. "I think it must have been spontaneous combustion in the paint locker. I can't account for it otherwise."
Yes. And Pellew knows he's not telling the truth. And so Pellew knows that Hornblower did something ingenious and heroic.
This is the very end of it, okay? He says, "He alone knew of his remissness in plugging that shot hole. He alone could decide on his punishment, and this was what he had chosen. This alone could reestablish him in his own eyes. And when the words were spoken, he felt enormous relief and not one single twinge of regret." And now here's Pellew, just the last line of the story, musing about the fire on the boat. He says, "It was fortunate all the same."
Right. But the reason this made such an impression on me as a boy, say, justice is something you have to demand from yourself. And what matters is not what you can get away with in the eyes of others. What matters is what you know to be true about yourself, whether you are right and when you are wrong.
Yeah.
And what you all through the other Hornblower stories, what unfolds, and that's why they don't make good movies. It is the story of a man with a moral code, trying to make his way in a world in which most people don't have a moral code. And he's not a martyr. He ends up, by the way, a very successful man. He ends up an admiral and a knight, a person of distinction, but he does not make the enormous career that a more ruthless operator would do. But he has enough success, but he never has to question whether he did the right, because he always holds himself to his standard. And it doesn't matter what others think. And I have to say that when I say I think about it all the time, I mean, I think all the time. I mean, when about for good or for ill. I mean, when you're subject to criticism or when you're subject to praise that you don't deserve. And those happen both. That I think of these stories and say what matters is what you know and the standard to which you hold yourself.
You know what this puts me in mind of is Plato's The Ring of Gyges, where I think it is you've got this ring that you can turn, and it makes you invisible.
Yeah.
And so what would you do if no one knew what you were doing?
Right. Well, that seems to me like a curse, because my wife years ago, when she was writing fiction, wrote a short story about someone who was afflicted with the curse of hearing what everyone he knew said about him when he wasn't there. And you don't want to know. You don't want to know. Even when it's good, you don't want to know. And so that really strikes me as a terrible affliction. It's
an option, I think, that you have. So, but it gets to your point. What if you could do anything you want without being punished? What would you do?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the lessons of the story is that condition does not exist for human beings because there is something. The price of doing whatever you want without being punished is lying, and the lie always has a price. And even if the lie is not caught, and even if the price is not imposed by others, the lie has a price for you. That every time you tell a lie, it changes you. My late mother used to say all the time, above all things, I hate a lie. Mm-hmm. And what she understood is it's simply that being a person who lives honestly with himself or herself, that is a great liberation. And we're not going to be martyrs about this. And you can create all kinds of far-fetched hypotheticals where, of course, you should lie. I mean, the Immanuel Kant, the axe murderer, comes to your house to ask who's hiding in the attic, and that's obviously dumb. Mm-hmm. But most of the time we don't live on the edge. Most of the time we live normal lives. And if you're living a normal life, it has a cost. And one of the things that we'll see with Hornblowers, his ability to be true to himself is the secret power through his career. And it's also what makes him do things that are very brave. He's not someone who's got bloodlust. He doesn't get an adrenaline surge that carries him. He has to, another one of the stories where he has to climb up a mast, cross whatever the crossbar is, leap onto the crossbar of another ship and come down the mast of the other ship. And he has to establish a chain of command. And he turns to his number two and says, Mr. So-and-so and then he uses the poetic term, die in battle, should I fall? And then it hits him. In this case, it is literally fall. and he has this clutch of fear at his heart, but he doesn't stop. And again, all through my life, I've always admired the kind of courage I admire is not the gung-ho. The person who says, I was never afraid, even if you suppose they're telling the truth, you think, well, then what did you accomplish? The person who accomplishes this person says, I was afraid every minute and I did it anyway.
Yes, I think that's the one thing that really I found quite striking about these two stories was he admits, well, that's why I started off by saying that he was scared. He admits that he's nervous and he's got anxiety. And this is quite unusual I didn't expect this in a kind of a swashbuckling kind of story.
Yeah, it ain't swashbuckling at all.
No, that's the impression that I had before I started it.
One of the other stories in that Midshipman collection, and I think maybe the first story, it's called An Even Chance. So Hornblower is being horribly, horribly bullied by someone who's much physically stronger than he is. And also someone who's got a little bit of seniority as a midshipman. So he has no appeal. And the Royal Navy doesn't police this in those days. And this elder midshipman terrorizes their little mess, bullies and abuses Hornblower. And Hornblower decides it would be better to commit suicide, but he can't quite do that. And the solution he comes up to this problem is he entraps the bully into insulting him in public in a way where there has to be, under the rules, there has to be a duel. And although the Royal Navy does not approve of dueling, the insult, he entraps him into an insult so flagrant and so public that although the Navy hates dueling, under the code of the time, they have to allow Hornblower to challenge the other midshipmen. And he's the injured party, he's given the choice of weapons. And the bully is going to be better with the sword, the bully's a better shot. So Hornblower says, my choice of weapon is that we have two pistols, one armed and one not. He calculates the odds. He's a thinker. It's a 50-50 break.
Which is fair, isn't it?
Well, it sort of startles the bully into thinking, because the bully counted on his advantages of power and speed to be able to. And we didn't think, and the bully, who's not too bright, didn't think that, wait a minute, if I do this, then he gets the choice of weapons. And if he gets the choice of weapons, then he can come up with a scheme where he has an even chance. One gun unarmed and one armed. And the solution that is hit on, I think it's pellew who does this, is pellew finds out about this and orders that neither pistol be armed. And so the two men emerge both alive and with dignity intact. There's more to that story too. But so I took, for me as a boy, there were a series of moral lessons in these stories in the context of not a preaching life. It's not like Sunday school moralism, but the morality of someone who in the books goes on to an active life, and who is involved in, the brutal business of war, and who does know every day that he is risking his, not every day, but isn't risking his life in battle and risking his life in all kinds of other ways too. Even when you weren't in battle, it was dangerous to be aboard those ships.
Yeah, that's another thing that comes off is that you said it was sort of disgusting and dirty, and there are rats, but there's also like a lot of the guys are drunk all the time. It's dangerous around there.
Yeah. Well, and it's full of industrial accidents. I mean, like people are being run. I mean, people get hit by heavy objects, and it's not a safety conscious environment. They did not post X days without an accident aboard aboard British warships of the Napoleonic era. They took them for granted. Plus disease, plus the terrible food, plus they're only beginning to figure out how scurvy works.
You talk about, we're talking about the fact that his vulnerabilities or his humanity is on display in these stories. And here's just a line where he yelled up to the deck, mastering the sick despair that he felt.
Mm-hmm. Well, because a lot of the time he finds himself in charge of other people's lives at an age when modern people would still be in high school, and he's always thinking, what do I do now? There's a line from another naval book, Herman Wouk's Cane Mutiny, which is a book that people tend not to read anymore.
It was written around the same time, I think, too.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, you walked into anybody's house and there would be rows of paperbacks of Herman Wouk's novels. Yes. And I somehow absorbed a snobbish disregard for him. He was like one of these big best-selling pop fiction writers of the 1950s before there's like Breaking Bad. So if you want something that's smarter than the movies, you would read these big pot-boiling novels, and there's these huge people. So and he's one of them. And so I always had absorbed this idea that there's something. You're a little too fancy, elegant to read Herman Wouk. And anyway, so I do a lot of physical activity, hiking, stair climbing, things like that. And I always listen to audiobooks when I do it. And after a while you run out. So I tried the Cane Mutiny because I'd heard so much about it. And it's got a lot of defects as a work of art. Absolutely no question about that. There's a hackish quality to Wouk. The snobbish impulse about him is true. But the Cane Mutiny remains the best novel ever written about a workplace. It's the story of this 22-year-old young man, Willie Keith, from a very privileged family, who is spoiled and self-indulgent and finds himself at war. And if you want to think of Willie Keith as a metaphor for the United States, Herman Wouk will not object. But anyway, so he spends the whole war aboard this decrepit minesweeper, the Cane, with a series, and he ends up in the final months of the war at age 25, the last captain of the Cane. And there's this scene where, and it's a World War I destroyer converted into a World War II minesweeper, and he goes to bed the first night that he's captain in like January of 1945 on the little bunk that is the captain's bunk. And you've seen them, like a metal slab with a vinyl mattress, an inch thick, 18 inches across, and that kind of military green. You've seen those mattresses, gray green. And he's just exhausted, and he collapses on it, and he closes his eyes. And the moment his eyes close, he thinks of something he forgot to do that day, and his eyes switch open again. And Wouk comments, when you're the captain of the ship, there's never a second of the day when you're not the captain.
Yeah.
And that's also like one of these great life lessons. And that's Hornblowers. He's put in charge of things at a very young age. And there's never, if you're in charge, you're in charge. And you're on the ocean. There is no one to help, and there's no one to ask.
Well, yes. I mean, there's a real sense of guilt that he feels too, quite a lot of the time, right? And another thing that's interesting, we talked about this patch that they were going to put over the hole that the cannon blasted into the hull. Well, he's the one that insists on being lowered down into the freezing water to check it out.
Yes.
So it's kind of odd that he's the one that's in charge, and yet he's doing this. Maybe he doesn't know how to delegate, or doesn't trust people, or what?
Well, partly is he has a sense of responsibility. He knows had he thought of it at the start, he might have ordered somebody else to do it.
Right.
But because he's cleaning up his own mess, he has to do it himself. But second, leaders lead from the front. And one of the things you are also going to discover is Hornblower is constantly gnawed by inadequacy and self-doubt. But you, as the boy reader, understand he's right. So he feels he does the task himself because he feels guilty and embarrassed and ashamed of his mistake. But you also see he's a real leader. There's a pop book about management called Leaders Eat Last. And I've hung around a little bit with military stuff and reporting on things. And this is like a code in every army that an officer does not eat until he has witnessed that every person in that officer's command has eaten first. I remember this being driven home to me. I was in about 2005. I was reporting from Iraq, and I was on a thing where the supreme American commander inside Iraq was part of this event. And there was then a lunch, and we had all the senior officers of the Iraqi army who were all titularly answerable to him, the supreme. He's not the supreme American, he's the multinational, he's the commander of all coalition forces in Iraq.
Right.
And he stood at the front of the chow line with a stack of plates in his hand and handed a plate to every Iraqi officer as they walked by. And only when they had all gone through did he go through. He was trying to drive home the point. And then the Iraqis look at him like, are you crazy? Like, who would be a commander if you have to eat last? The whole point of being a commander
is to get it first. Yeah.
To eat first and take everybody's pay while you do it. But he was trying to teach them that in an effective organization, the leader eats last. And that's, again, a theme that is driven home by these. You see him again. There's this enormous divide between this is a brutal class society. And although Hornblower doesn't have much money, he is from a gentleman's background. So that's like a whole planet away from these naval seamen, and one of the things we see him do is he has care for the health and well-being of his men. That is, again, very unlike what would have been the standard of the time in the Royal Navy.
Yeah. We talked about him going over the side. He says, I'll go over the side myself, he said. He could not analyze the motives which impelled him to say that. Partly he wanted to see things with his own eyes. Partly he was influenced by the doctrine that he should never give an order he was not prepared to carry out himself. But mostly it must have been the desire to impose a penance on himself for his negligence.
Yeah, this is then more personal. I mean, I do this all through. Like when I think I've messed up in some way, I have my secret penances that and not in a kind of hair shirt way, but I learned that from him, that if you've done something and there's no one, and you've done something wrong and there's no one you could, and you haven't maybe even wronged someone you could apologize to.
Yeah.
You have to pay it back somehow. You have to invent for yourself a way to pay it back, to impose a price on yourself for the thing you did.
Well, I suppose that way you learn not to do it again.
Oh, you always do it again.
The thing is, though, you need some sort of punishment to change your behavior. No,
that's not what, for me, that's not what you learn, because so many of these things, it's just we fail. What you learn is first not to lie to yourself about what happened.
Right. You take responsibility.
You don't make an excuse. And even if no one saw, and you face it and you admit it and you acknowledge it to yourself. And again, a lot of these things, I don't want to be, it's embarrassing. I don't want to go into too much detail, but a lot of these things are quite impersonal. So, it's not like you yelled at your kid, or you forgot your anniversary, or, you blocked the neighbor's driveway on garbage day. Those are all things we can apologize for. But there's some things that are more impersonal, things where you sort of wronged the universe. And you can't apologize. There's no one to apologize to. But what you can do, and people, this is where the human mind.
You wronged the universe? Tell me how you've wronged the universe.
Well, okay, that sounds a little grandiose, isn't it? Like, yes, I wrecked a planet. No, it's like that, summed up by that famous line of Nietzsche's that memory says I did this, pride says I cannot have done that, and after a struggle, memory yields. So
Right.
it's those kinds of things, and those kinds of categories of offenses where it's the wallet you find on the sidewalk.
Okay, and you don't return it.
Well, or you're not or for some reason there's what you find the wallet on the sidewalk and there's no ID in the wallet. Okay, I'm going to make up a hypothetical. The wallet's got $100. There's no ID in the wallet. You cannot return it. What do you do with the $100? Well, you don't put it in your bank account. You have to find some way to get rid of the $100 because it doesn't belong to you. And there are a lot of opportunities here to take credit. You don't, like, and giving away that $100, it's not a meritorious act. It's not like something you say, let me take a selfie of myself giving the $100 to the Sally Ann. That you have to find some way to take the unearned, undeserved $100, get it to the Sally Ann in a way that doesn't give you any credit because you don't deserve credit because it wasn't your $100.
Yes. Well, you deserve credit for being honest because most people or 50% or whatever percent would have pocketed it.
You may deserve from God or whoever's running the universe some credit in that case, but what you don't deserve is to shine in the eyes of your neighbors because you just did the right thing.
You're just being honest.
Yeah. So and it's not your money, so you should give. And like when we were talking about other characters of these codes, and one of the things that another character I like very much, Philip Marlowe, and he's always doing this. That Marlowe will be in a situation where he's a private detective in Los Angeles in the span of time from the, I guess, late 30s to late 50s, and Marlowe, his clients, of course, are people who are in some way or another on the wrong side of the law, because if they had a clear-cut problem, they wouldn't need him. And so in order to secure his loyalty, he has a set of fees, and you can see the move from the Depression to the 50s, because over the course of the novels, his fee goes up. I'm going to forget what it is, but like the first ones, you think, wow, that's kind of shy. He's like, my fee is $20 a day plus expenses, but those are 1934.
That's early.
But people will often offer him more money than his fee,
right?
And he always refuses it, and he'll always say, no, because I know if you're offering me more than my fee, you're going to ask me to do something that I don't normally do.
Right. Well, is this like training? You've got a conscience. You read these books. It seems to me your parents would have been the number one teacher of things like morals, but you've got this innate conscience as well, right?
Well, this is not about conscience. It's about code, because.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, because a conscience. Okay, let's see. A conscience tells us about the things that are universally true, and codes are about things that are sort of situationally right. So, that Alphonse Gaston joke about the two Frenchmen so polite that neither of them ever goes through the door first, because so there's someone has to go through the door first. And even if you go through the door first when you shouldn't go through the door first, you haven't committed a moral crime. That doesn't rest on your conscience.
No.
But there's a code in every society, in every person. There's a code, and in some societies it would be
etiquette.
It's a little bit more than that, because there's a moral idea. Well, it's etiquette if it's just the most important person goes through the door first.
Okay.
Hornblower is an example of this. There are a lot of things that are incumbent on Hornblower because he's an officer. They're not incumbent on him because he's a human being. They're incumbent on him because he accepted a certain responsibility. And with that responsibility came obligations.
Okay, I guess the point I'm trying to get at, though, is you didn't learn your conscience from reading these. You had the conscience to start with. Yeah. So what more than conscience did these books teach you?
Okay. Well, it's not immoral to decline to climb a ladder if you're scared of heights. That is, you don't have to feel guilty about it. God won't judge you. God made you afraid of heights. God's not mad at you for not. But maybe the thing is this, and this is the code. Remember this famous distinction, I forget where it comes from, between shame and guilt. So the things you feel guilty about, that's morality. The things you feel shame about, that's your code.
That's more societal, isn't it?
It's more situational. So I mean, it's there's no disgrace if you're afraid of heights. There's no disgrace not going up a height.
Yeah.
But
right.
but if you've undertaken to be an officer in the Royal Navy in the year 1794, with that opportunity comes the responsibility to climb up the rigging of the ship when you're told to do it. And even if you're scared, it doesn't matter. You have to do it. And you will be disgraced, not in the eyes of God or society or the world, in the eyes of the immediate little society around you, if you don't do it.
Yes, in fact, there's exactly that point is raised in when he's talking about, here it is right here. Hornblower hesitated for a long second. He knew he was ungainly and awkward. Book learning was of no use when it came to jumping into the boat, but he had to make the leap, for Pellew was fuming behind him, and the eyes of the boat's crew and of the whole ship's company were on him. Better to jump and hurt himself, better to jump and make an exhibition of himself than to delay the ship.
Yes. Okay. So that I remember those words. Like, so I was, when I was 14, I was nearsighted. I was uncoordinated. I was not very athletic. And I've spent all my life being a ferocious, climb things, lift weights, I'm someone who is not at all naturally athletic, like hardening myself. And I always think about that, it's better to break your leg than not to jump when it's your time to jump.
So it's peer pressure.
Well, if it's only peer pressure, then it's bad. It's the codes are a little bit about the internalization of peer pressure, but it's peer pressure to do something that is right within the society. Now, look, yes, this can obviously go wrong. And a lot of honor codes, like, I'm sure in a lot of the Mafia works on these same principles.
Yeah.
And that's why it's not a matter of morality. That's why we don't say conscience, because the Hornblower, if he had joined the Mafia instead of the Royal Navy, these capabilities and tendencies of his would lead him to some very antisocial acts. So where the morality comes in is, okay, step one, join the Royal Navy, not the Mafia. And maybe that's the way, because that's one of the reasons why do people love the Mafia books, like the Godfather, because those people all have codes. But in those cases, they have, I think that's why the reason the Godfather is so interesting is they have a code that is completely divorced from morality. And maybe that's the book you read next. And maybe that's the criticism of maybe that's the next evolution of your consciousness after you read Hornblower at 14, is read The Godfather at 19 and say, oh yeah? Well, what if they're saying you have to go assassinate that shop owner because he didn't pay the protection money? That's our code. So in the end, conscience and morality have to trump. Guilt must trump shame. Conscience must trump code. Morality must trump ethics. But along the way, thank you. I have never thought about it quite that way, but I think, but if you've joined a pro-social organization, or if you've signed up to a pro-social commitments, then your code and your conscience can align. Don't join the Mafia.
It's true, though, isn't it? We do I think The Sopranos is one of the best TV shows ever made.
Right. And The Godfather is, one of the greatest American movies. And so they all have this.
Two of them are, yeah.
Right. But they're constantly wrestling with that. Is what are the rules of our little sub-society? I think that's why one of the reasons why spy novels are so interesting is spies are doing things that are objectively immoral. I mean, almost as bad as the Mafia people, lying and cheating and stealing, but they're doing it for their country.
Well, yes. I mean, think of it, though. He pulls out his pistol here and he's willing to blow this French captain away. For doing what? Just being on the other side. And so that brings up, is patriotism join the army and join the Mafia? I mean, there's some similarities there.
Well, this is when it's then we have larger questions. You know, there's a line attributed to Cavour, the great statesman of Italian unification, who is supposed to have said to his associates, "Gentlemen, if we ever did for ourselves what we have done for Italy, what great scoundrels we would be." Okay,
Yes.
so now the test is, who's your country? And I mean, I'm reading right now this. I'll put this up. Really interesting book about the dismantling of the Soviet and American nuclear arsenals at the end of the Cold War. The Dead Hand by David Hoffman. Especially in these days where we are so much despair about the state of the world. It's just about those magical moments in the early 90s when we're building down nuclear arsenals and securing it. But there's this paradox, which is the American and Soviet scientists are so similar. They're peers, except one worked, in my opinion, and I think it's more than an opinion, for an essentially good political order, and one worked for an essentially bad political order. And so although they are peers and colleagues, and there's a lot of mutual recognition, in the end, they're not the same.
Yes, but the Soviet scientists didn't have a choice.
Well, this enters code. Maybe they didn't have a choice consistent with their ambition and their desire for reward.
They'd get shot if they defected.
If you defected. But if you defected. But don't be a scientist. Don't join the weapons program.
Don't follow your passion?
Well, in that case, it's more don't follow the rewards of you're in a bad society. They were driven by career. They're also driven by career, and there are a lot of things there are a lot of ways to apply your scientific expertise that were not the weapons program. There were special rewards, special incentives. They were the best paid. They got the best healthcare. They got the best food. None of it that good, but better than other people.
That same argument holds true for the Americans too. Why are they nuclear scientists?
Right. So that's where these things get complicated. And that's Hornblower pointing the pistol at the French captain. That's Cavour and what great scoundrels we would be. And that's where code and ethics on the one hand and conscience and morality on that. In the end, you can't just follow your code. It's not just enough, because the code always has to be questioned in the light of more profound universal morality. But if you believe you're as Hornblower did, that he's in a basically good society and a basically good organization, and that organization has a code, and some of the code is pretty harsh. The punishments are brutal.
Well, even the press gangs dragging people into I'm not sure when that ended, but I think there is mention of that, the fact that it was still taking place, right?
That doesn't end until the end of the Napoleonic Wars.
Right.
I think there's a scene again in Midshipman where a crewman whom Hornblower basically likes, they're in a situation where the supply has been interrupted. They're on short rations, and a sailor steals some food from the hold and then is horrifically punished. And Hornblower tries to defend him, and then his defense is rejected. And not only is it rejected, but he's then required to be an extra assertive part of the system of punishment of this sailor for speaking out of turn. Yeah. Anyway, as I said, these are lessons all these years later, I still think about them. I probably have not read a Hornblower story since the 1970s, but I read them so often at the time that they're just engraved in my brain.
And do you attribute your high level of morality to them, or is that your parents?
I wouldn't claim a high level, but I would say that I just learned from them. I learned from them. I'm not going to. I just learned from them. They influence me. I think about them. And it's not the only thing. I mean, as I said, codes aren't everything. There's morality, there's right and wrong. They're sort of profounder notions than code. But on a day-to-day basis, we don't live. At least I've never lived in an extreme scenario. I mean, I've never had to face, those ultimate questions of life and death, of being in a war zone, of living under dictatorship. I mean, those things where you have to make really radical moral decisions. In the worlds I've lived in, within the context of a society that I think of as basically good and decent, you have little choices. And our tests are the tests like the $100 bill on the sidewalk without the ID beside it. What do you do?
Anything else to say about the stories, about the character?
I could talk about them forever and ever and ever, but we've talked for an hour, so that's probably enough for me on my senile reminiscence about these books I loved. But I do love them, and I've given them to all my children, and I don't want to assert that they would have a special power with boys. I've just noticed that they have special power with boys.
Well, let's hope they continue to be read for centuries to come, because there's not much more important than having a high character.
Yeah, or being confronted with the need to develop one, even if you fail and fail and fail and fail again, because the moment you start saying, "Well, what a character I've got."
Yes. You mean like I tried to make you say there?
Yeah, the moment you say that, that's you've flunked the test.
Well, you didn't flunk then.
Bye-bye. Good to talk to you.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.